Throughout history, certain individuals have been blessed with the extraordinary gift of seeing beyond the veil of our physical reality. Among these rare souls, Edgar stands as one of the most documented and accurate seers of the modern era. Known as the sleeping prophet, his trance-induced readings offered profound insights into humanity's past, present, and future. When Edgar spoke of America's destiny, his words carried both warning and wisdom. His visions regarding natural catastrophes weren't meant to instill fear, but rather to awaken consciousness to the deeper spiritual laws that govern our existence. These prophecies weren't simply predictions of random events, but revelations of how Earth responds to humanity's collective consciousness and actions. Edgar foresaw a time when America would face unprecedented natural challenges, a period that seems to align with our current moment. He spoke of significant Earth changes that would affect the United States, particularly along its coastal regions. In his readings, he described how the land itself would shift and transform, with particular emphasis on the western coastline, where seismic activities would intensify. The Earth, in Edgar's understanding, is not merely an inanimate object, but a living entity that responds to the vibrational frequencies of human thought and behavior. When these frequencies fall out of harmony with universal law, the Earth itself begins a process of rebalancing. This principle explains why natural disasters often coincide with periods of moral and spiritual decline. In reading 3976-15, given in January 1934, he stated, "The Earth will be broken up in the western portion of America. The greater portion of Japan must go into the sea. The upper portion of Europe will be changed as in the twinkling of an eye. While some of these events have partially manifested, others appear to be unfolding in our time or awaiting fulfillment." The significance of October in these prophecies relates to celestial alignments that Edgar understood as catalysts for earthly change. October represents a time when certain cosmic forces intensify their influence on our planet, creating conditions where the thin veil between dimensions allows for accelerated transformation, both destructive and creative. Edgar's visions specifically mentioned increasing volcanic activity and earthquakes that would affect the Pacific Ring of Fire, a region encompassing the western coast of the Americas, extending to Alaska and down to Chile. These seismic events weren't described as isolated incidents, but as part of a larger pattern of Earth adjustments that would trigger secondary effects, including unusual weather patterns, flooding in unexpected regions, and shifts in ocean currents. What makes these prophecies particularly relevant to our current era is the acceleration of climate anomalies we've witnessed in recent decades. The prophet described how these natural phenomena would intensify, creating scenarios where traditional seasons would be disrupted, causing agricultural challenges and necessitating new approaches to food production and distribution. Yet within these sobering predictions lies a profound spiritual teaching. These earthly trials weren't depicted as random punishments, but as necessary cleansing processes, opportunities for humanity to reassess its relationship with the planet and with higher spiritual principles. The intensification of natural forces serves as a cosmic alarm clock, awakening humanity from its materialistic slumber. For those with spiritual understanding, these prophecies offer not despair, but clarity. They remind us that we exist within a larger universal order, where cause and effect operate on collective as well as individual levels. The coming challenges, while difficult, create the conditions for unprecedented spiritual growth and the emergence of new, more conscious ways of living. The wisdom teaches us to prepare on multiple levels: physically, through practical readiness, emotionally, through inner stability, and spiritually through deepened connection to divine guidance. Those who heed these teachings understand that external security can never be guaranteed, but internal security, that profound connection to Source, remains unshakable, regardless of external circumstances. As we witness increasing Earth changes, we're called to remember that prophecy serves not to frighten, but to awaken. Each natural event carries encoded spiritual messages for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. The Earth speaks through these phenomena, calling humanity back to harmony with natural and cosmic law. What steps can we take in light of these prophetic insights? First, cultivate inner stillness to receive guidance specific to your life path. Second, simplify your material dependencies while strengthening community bonds. Third, Develop adaptability in your thinking and living arrangements. And perhaps most importantly, recognize that these times of trial are simultaneously times of unprecedented spiritual opportunity. The prophecies remind us that America's destiny is not separate from its spiritual awakening. The natural challenges catalyze a deeper questioning, a reassessment of values, and ultimately a return to the spiritual principles upon which true civilization must be founded. In the vast archive of prophetic insights left by Edgar, perhaps none are more relevant to our current moment than his warnings about America's moral and spiritual decline. While his visions of physical catastrophes often capture immediate attention, it was the spiritual deterioration of the nation that he identified as the deeper and more consequential crisis facing America. According to Edgar's readings, the true pain awaiting America would not primarily manifest through external disasters, but through an internal collapse of ethical foundations and spiritual connectedness. This moral disintegration would create a void in the collective soul of the nation, leaving it vulnerable to forces of division, materialism, and spiritual confusion. In numerous readings, he emphasized how America was originally established with a spiritual purpose, to develop and demonstrate a new expression of human freedom, aligned with divine principles. This spiritual mission was embedded in the nation's founding, regardless of the personal flaws of its founders. Yet Edgar foresaw periods when this spiritual destiny would be severely tested, when the nation would stray far from its original purpose. The prophet described with remarkable accuracy the symptoms of this spiritual decline: the fragmentation of families, the worship of material success above character development, the degradation of media and entertainment, the corruption of leadership, and most significantly, the replacement of true spiritual practice with either rigid religiosity or empty secularism. This spiritual crisis manifests in numerous ways that we can observe in contemporary America. The epidemic of loneliness and isolation, despite technological connectivity, reflects the spiritual principle that when souls disconnect from their divine source, they inevitably disconnect from each other. The pervasive anxiety and depression affecting millions speaks to a society that has lost its spiritual anchor points and existential meaning. Edgar's readings specifically mentioned how spiritual values would be systematically removed from public institutions and education, creating generations increasingly disconnected from traditional moral frameworks. Without these shared ethical foundations, he foresaw that public discourse would deteriorate into competing power narratives rather than collaborative truth-seeking. The spiritual teachings emphasize that this moral decline isn't simply a cultural phenomenon, but represents a deviation from universal spiritual laws. When societies prioritize material acquisition over spiritual development, when self-interest eclipses service to others, when immediate gratification overwhelms long-term stewardship, these choices create energetic imbalances that inevitably manifest as social discord and eventually as physical adjustments in the environment itself. One particularly insightful aspect of Edgar's prophecies was his understanding of how technological advancement without corresponding spiritual development would create dangerous imbalances. He foresaw how humanity would gain godlike powers through technology, while lacking the spiritual wisdom to use these powers responsibly. This warning seems especially prescient in our era of artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, and weapons of mass destruction. The prophet described cycles of civilization where periods of great material achievement often precede spiritual awakening through crisis. The very success of a civilization creates conditions where souls become attached to comfort, convenience, and control, forgetting their deeper spiritual nature and purpose. The subsequent painful collapse of these external supports serves as a cosmic mechanism to redirect attention to what is eternal and essential. Yet Edgar's spiritual teachings always balanced warning with hope. The moral decline was never presented as inevitable or irreversible. Rather, it represented a necessary phase in the spiritual evolution of America, a dark night of the collective soul that would ultimately create the conditions for spiritual renewal. The spiritual teaching embedded in these prophecies reminds us that nations, like individuals, possess free will. The future is not absolutely predetermined, but exists as probability fields that shift according to consciousness and choice. While certain karmic patterns may be unavoidable, how we respond to them remains our sovereign decision. For those seeking to navigate these times of moral confusion, Edgar's readings consistently emphasized certain spiritual practices: daily meditation to maintain divine connection, service to others as the practical expression of spiritual understanding, study of spiritual principles across traditions, and perhaps most importantly, the application of these principles in everyday decisions and relationships. The spiritual deterioration of America was never described as happening to the nation, but rather as happening through the collective choices of its people. Each compromise of integrity, each prioritization of convenience over conscience, each betrayal of known truth contributes to the larger pattern of decline. Conversely, each act of moral courage, each choice for compassion over comfort, each stand for truth against expediency helps to reweave the spiritual fabric of society. America's spiritual testing ground exists not primarily in its institutions, but in its homes, workplaces, and community gatherings. It is in these ordinary contexts that the extraordinary choice between fear and love, between separation and unity, between material and spiritual values, is continuously made. The accumulation of these choices determines the nation's trajectory more powerfully than any external policy or event. As we witness the increasing polarization, moral confusion, and spiritual emptiness in modern America, these prophecies serve not to condemn, but to clarify. They remind us that what we're experiencing isn't random societal evolution, but the predictable outcome of specific spiritual choices made over generations. More importantly, they affirm that different choices remain possible, both individually and collectively. Among the most penetrating aspects of Edgar's prophetic vision was his understanding of how America would experience profound economic and social upheaval as part of its spiritual journey. These weren't merely political or economic predictions, but revelations about how material conditions serve spiritual awakening through cycles of prosperity, crisis, and transformation. Edgar foresaw that America would experience economic volatility unlike anything in its previous history, not as punishment, but as a necessary rebalancing of energies that had become severely distorted through materialism and financial excess. His readings described how the nation's economic system would undergo several dramatic shifts, each one stripping away layers of illusion about the nature of true wealth and security. The prophet specifically warned about the dangers of economic systems disconnected from ethical foundations. He described how financial instruments would become increasingly complex and abstract, creating the illusion of prosperity while masking fundamental imbalances. This prophecy has manifested through the proliferation of sophisticated financial derivatives, digital currencies, and economic metrics that often bear little relation to the lived reality of ordinary people. Edgar's readings contained remarkable insights about the relationship between economic conditions and spiritual consciousness. He explained that money itself is neutral, merely a form of energy, but becomes problematic when it replaces spiritual values as the primary measure of worth and success. When a society begins valuing people based on their financial status rather than their character and contribution, it creates energetic distortions that eventually manifest as economic crises. These economic prophecies weren't limited to financial markets, but extended to fundamental questions about work, technology, and human purpose. Edgar foresaw how automation and technological advancement would eliminate traditional forms of employment faster than new opportunities could emerge, creating periods of widespread economic dislocation. This transition wasn't portrayed as negative in itself, but rather as a necessary evolution, forcing humanity to reconsider the purpose of work beyond mere survival. The social dimensions of Edgar's prophecies are equally relevant today. He described how American society would become increasingly polarized along multiple dimensions: wealth disparities, ideological differences, geographical divisions, and generational perspectives. This fragmentation wasn't presented as random, but as the surfacing of deep karmic patterns that had remained unresolved throughout the nation's history. Of particular significance was his insight that America would experience a period where social cohesion would weaken dramatically, with traditional institutions losing their binding power. Families, religious organizations, civic groups, and educational institutions would all struggle to maintain their traditional roles in creating shared meaning and community bonds. This institutional weakening would create a vacuum where both destructive and constructive forces could emerge. Edgar's readings depicted social media and communication technologies with remarkable foresight, describing how they would simultaneously connect people across vast distances while often deepening psychological isolation. He warned about the spiritual dangers of technologies that create the appearance of connection without the substance of true relationship, and how these would contribute to increasing social fragmentation despite their potential for unity. The prophet foresaw how economic pressure would intensify existing social divisions, particularly around race, immigration, and regional interests. These tensions would reach critical points where they could either tear the nation apart or catalyze a higher synthesis through spiritual awakening. The choice between these outcomes would depend not on external circumstances, but on the collective spiritual response of the American people. One of the most challenging aspects of Edgar's economic prophecies involved what he called the purification of the money system. He described periods when financial systems would experience severe disruptions, revealing their fundamental flaws and necessitating complete reimagining of economic relationships. These wouldn't be mere recessions or temporary downturns, but profound structural transformations affecting every aspect of economic life. Yet within these sobering economic and social prophecies lies a powerful spiritual teaching. The destabilization of external systems forces a return to fundamental questions about what truly sustains human life and community. When financial security proves illusory, when social structures fail to provide meaning, souls are naturally redirected toward deeper sources of sustenance and connection. Edgar's readings consistently emphasized that economic challenges should be understood as spiritual opportunities rather than material problems. Financial difficulties force a re-evaluation of priorities, a simplification of lifestyles, and often a rediscovery of non-material sources of fulfillment. Social fragmentation creates the conditions for new, more authentic forms of community to emerge based on shared values rather than mere proximity or convention. The spiritual wisdom embedded in these economic and social prophecies reminds us that all external conditions serve the evolution of consciousness. Periods of material abundance often lead to spiritual complacency, while economic contraction can awaken dormant spiritual qualities of resilience, creativity, generosity, and interdependence. For those seeking to navigate these times of economic uncertainty and social division, Edgar's teachings offer several practical principles. Maintain perspective by remembering that material conditions are temporary while spiritual development is eternal. Practice generosity, especially during times of scarcity. Strengthen local community bonds as larger systems become less reliable. Develop skills of self-reliance while avoiding isolation. And perhaps most importantly, use economic challenges as opportunities to clarify what truly matters. America's economic and social transformations were never presented as separate from its spiritual journey, but as integral aspects of the same evolutionary process. The economic pain serves to break attachments to material security, while social fragmentation creates the necessary conditions for more authentic forms of community to emerge. As we witness unprecedented economic volatility and social division in contemporary America, these prophecies offer not just explanation, but guidance. They remind us that we're experiencing not random events, but a coherent process of spiritual awakening through the dissolution of unsustainable patterns. More importantly, they affirm that how we respond to these challenges, individually and collectively, determines whether they lead to further suffering or to spiritual transformation. In the profound spiritual cosmology revealed through Edgar's readings, one of the most significant insights concerns the operation of karmic law at the collective level. While karma is often understood as an individual phenomenon, the prophet consistently emphasized that nations, like individuals, are subject to spiritual laws of cause and effect that operate across vast spans of time. America, according to these teachings, is not exempt from these universal principles. The nation has accumulated both positive and negative karma throughout its history, receiving spiritual credit for its ideals of freedom and opportunity, while simultaneously accruing karmic debt through historical injustices, materialism, and military interventions. Edgar foresaw that the time would come when this national karma would require balancing through a period of purification. This karmic purification isn't punishment in the conventional sense, but rather the compassionate operation of universal law that brings all things back into harmony with divine principles. Just as physical pain alerts us to imbalances in the body, collective suffering serves to highlight where a nation has deviated from its spiritual purpose. These painful trials represent not divine anger, but divine love seeking to redirect a nation back toward its highest potential. Edgar's readings specifically identified several areas where America's karmic reckoning would be most intense. The nation's treatment of indigenous peoples, its history of slavery and racial injustice, its exploitation of natural resources, its patterns of international dominance, and its elevation of material wealth over spiritual values were all identified as areas requiring karmic adjustment. The difficulties facing contemporary America in precisely these domains reflect the working out of these karmic patterns. The prophet was careful to explain that karmic law operates not through vengeance, but through learning opportunities. The challenges facing America aren't designed to punish, but to educate, to create conditions where the spiritual lessons that have been avoided can finally be integrated. When a nation consistently ignores spiritual principles in its collective choices, the intensity of the resulting karmic correction naturally increases. One of the most misunderstood aspects of Edgar's karmic teachings involves timing. While karma operates with mathematical precision, its manifestation often occurs when consciousness is sufficiently prepared to receive and integrate the lesson. The convergence of multiple karmic patterns in our current era suggests that America has reached a critical threshold in its collective spiritual development, a moment when deeper understanding has become possible. Edgar foresaw that America's karmic purification would proceed through several distinct phases. The initial phase involves the surfacing of hidden patterns, bringing to light what has been denied, suppressed, or ignored in the national consciousness. This explains the intensification of racial tensions, environmental crises, and economic disparities that can no longer be overlooked. The second phase involves the direct experience of consequences flowing from past choices. The third phase, available but not guaranteed, involves conscious transformation through the integration of these karmic lessons. The spiritual teachings emphasize that while karmic patterns create certain inevitabilities, the conscious response to these patterns remains a matter of free will. America cannot avoid experiencing the consequences of its historical choices, but it retains the freedom to choose how it responds to these consequences, whether through denial and resistance that prolongs suffering, or through acknowledgement and transformation that accelerates healing. Perhaps the most profound aspect of Edgar's karmic teachings concerns the relationship between individual and collective karma. While national karma creates the general conditions affecting all citizens, individual spiritual development can create a degree of insulation from collective difficulties. Those who live in harmony with spiritual principles may still experience the external conditions of karmic purification, but will find inner resources to move through these challenges with grace and purpose. For those seeking to navigate these times of national karmic adjustment, Edgar's readings offer several essential spiritual practices: self-examination, to identify where one has personally contributed to collective patterns requiring correction; forgiveness work, to release karmic bindings; service to others as a means of generating positive karma; and spiritual study to understand the deeper purpose behind challenging circumstances. The prophet consistently emphasized that karmic law operates not toward punishment, but toward restoration of divine harmony. Even the most difficult karmic corrections contain within them the seeds of renewal and advancement. America's painful trials represent not its destruction, but its purification, the necessary preparation for the nation to fulfill its higher spiritual destiny in service to global awakening. Edgar's readings contain a particularly important teaching about how karmic patterns can be transmuted through consciousness. While certain consequences may be inevitable due to past causes set in motion, the spiritual impact of these consequences can be dramatically altered through understanding, acceptance, and love. A nation that consciously recognizes its karmic patterns can move through them with far less suffering than one that resists them through denial. The timing of America's karmic reckoning in October holds special significance in the spiritual calendar. This month, represents a period when the veil between dimensions thins, allowing deeper spiritual forces to operate more directly in material reality. The intensification of America's trials during this period reflects cosmic timing designed to maximize the spiritual potential of these challenging experiences. Edgar's prophecies about America's karmic purification consistently balance sobering realism with spiritual optimism. While not minimizing the difficulties ahead, he maintained absolute faith in the divine plan unfolding through these challenging transitions. The pain serves purpose. The difficulties develop strength. The trials teach wisdom that could be gained in no other way. As we witness America moving through this period of karmic adjustment, these teachings remind us to look beyond surface events to their spiritual significance. What appears as collapse from a material perspective may represent breakthrough from a spiritual viewpoint. What seems like failure in conventional terms may be success in soul terms. The very circumstances that challenge our external security often strengthen our internal connection to divine support. America's karmic purification ultimately serves its spiritual awakening. Through the dissolution of what is false, unsustainable, and unaligned with divine principles, space is created for the emergence of what is authentic, regenerative, and spiritually aligned. The pain of this transition is proportional to resistance. The grace available is proportional to surrender. For those with spiritual understanding, these times of national karmic reckoning represent an unprecedented opportunity for both individual and collective transformation. By consciously participating in this purification process, acknowledging historical patterns, making amends where possible, and creating new patterns aligned with higher principles, we contribute to America's spiritual rebirth and the fulfillment of its true destiny as a light among nations. This period of purification, while challenging beyond anything in living memory, prepares the way for America's most significant contribution to human evolution, not through material power or technological advancement, but through the demonstration of a society realigned with spiritual law, where freedom serves love and prosperity serves purpose. If these teachings about America's spiritual trials and awakening have resonated with your soul, don't keep this wisdom to yourself. Subscribe now to receive more profound spiritual insights that can help you navigate these transformative times with greater awareness and purpose. Leave a comment below, sharing which aspect of Edgar's prophecies speaks most directly to your own experience. Your perspective might be exactly what another seeker needs to hear today. Remember, true spiritual knowledge becomes wisdom only when shared. Join our community of conscious seekers as we walk this path of awakening together.